July 22, 1921. The thick North Carolina heat hung over Cumberland County like a wet blanket as Deputy Sheriff Alfred Pate moved through the dense woods near Godwin, following the faint, sweet smell of fermenting corn mash. He and his fellow officers had received word about an illegal still operation, one of hundreds that flourished during America's Prohibition era, when making moonshine was both a crime and, for many rural families, the only way to survive. Pate was a husband, a father, a lawman doing his duty. He had no way of knowing that within the hour, he would be dead, and that his death would inadvertently set in motion the creation of America's most produced weapon of World War II. The raid happened quickly. Officers surrounded the still. Shouts erupted. Then gunfire. When the smoke cleared and the echoes faded into the Carolina pines, Deputy Pate lay on the ground, shot twice, his life bleeding away into the forest floor. The moonshiners scattered into the woods, but authorities knew exactly who they were hunting. David Marshall Williams, a 20-year-old man with extraordinary mechanical talent and an equally extraordinary capacity for trouble. David Marshall Williams was born on November 13, 1900, the son of James Claude Williams, a prosperous landowner in a part of North Carolina where land and legacy meant everything. But young Marsh, as family called him, never quite fit the mold his father had cast for him. He dropped out of school in 8th grade, finding book learning tedious and pointless. What captivated him were machines, the way gears meshed, the way metal could be shaped and transformed, the mechanical poetry of things that moved and worked. He apprenticed at a blacksmith shop, where his hands learned the language of steel and fire. At 15, hungry for adventure, Williams lied about his age and joined the United States Navy. The deception didn't last long. When the Navy discovered his true age, they discharged him. He enrolled at Blackstone Military Academy in Virginia, but his time there ended in scandal when he was caught stealing government property. Several rifles and more than 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Williams had the audacity to ship the rifle stocks home and refused to return them. Even then, his fascination with firearms bordered on obsession. In 1918, Williams married and took a job as a manual laborer with the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad. It seemed, perhaps, that he was finally settling down. But the restless energy that defined him couldn't be contained by the monotony of railroad work. One day, he pulled out a pistol and fired at a passing bird. He missed the bird but hit something more valuable, his employment. He was fired on the spot. With few legitimate options and a family to feed, Williams turned to the one industry in North Carolina that was both booming and illegal, moonshine. During Prohibition, making and selling illegal whiskey wasn't just profitable. It was a kind of rural defiance against a federal law that felt distant and unjust to mountain folk who'd been making corn liquor for generations. Williams proved as talented at distilling as he was at metalwork. He ran multiple stills, carefully hidden in the dense forests and hollows of Cumberland County. For a while, it worked. For a while, he made good money. Then came that July day in 1921, when Deputy Pate led the raid that would end one life and forever alter another. Williams fled the scene, but he couldn't run far in a county where everyone knew the Williams family. Within days, authorities had him in custody. He was charged with first-degree murder, a capital offense in North Carolina, punishable by death. The trial was a spectacle. Williams, perhaps grasping at any defense that might save his life, pleaded insanity. The jury couldn't reach a verdict. 11 jurors voted to convict. One lone holdout insisted Williams was not mentally fit to stand trial. The judge declared a mistrial. Facing the prospect of a second trial and the very real possibility of the electric chair, Williams made a calculated decision. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. On the day of sentencing, the judge handed down 20 to 30 years of hard labor at Caledonia Prison Farm in Halifax County, North Carolina. Williams was 21 years old. If he served his full sentence, he would be over 50 when he tasted freedom again, if he survived that long. Caledonia Prison Farm was not a place designed for rehabilitation. It was a place designed to break men. Prisoners worked the fields under the merciless southern sun, growing cotton and corn that the state would sell for profit. Discipline was harsh. Hope was scarce. For many men, Caledonia was simply a slower, more miserable form of death penalty. But David Marshall Williams was not like other men. He had something that prison couldn't take from him. A mind that never stopped working, hands that could transform scrap metal into precision machinery, and a vision of mechanical possibilities that existed nowhere except in his imagination. More importantly, he found something in prison that had eluded him in freedom: purpose. The man who would change Williams' life was H.T. Peoples, the superintendent of Caledonia Prison Farm. Peoples was that rare prison official who believed that some men could be redeemed, that punishment didn't have to mean waste. He watched Williams carefully during those early days. He saw past the convicted murderer to the gifted machinist underneath. Peoples noticed how Williams could fix anything: tractors that wouldn't start, tools that seemed beyond repair, machinery that even experienced mechanics had given up on. Williams had an intuitive understanding of how things worked, an ability to see solutions that eluded others. Peoples made a decision that was either visionary or reckless, depending on one's perspective. He assigned Williams to work in the prison blacksmith shop and machine shop, where inmates repaired farm equipment and maintained the tools necessary to keep the prison farm operating. For Williams, this was salvation. The machine shop became his laboratory, his university, his church. At first, Williams did what was expected. He repaired broken equipment, sharpened tools, kept the prison machinery running. But at night, after his assigned work was complete, he began sketching. His mother, who never stopped believing in her son, sent him a drafting set and technical manuals. Williams began designing firearms. It seems almost absurd: a convicted murderer imprisoned for shooting a lawman, spending his nights designing better, more efficient guns. The irony was not lost on anyone. But Williams wasn't designing guns for violence. He was solving problems that had frustrated firearms designers for decades. He was pursuing mechanical perfection with the same single-minded intensity that some men pursue God. One night, Superintendent Peoples walked into the machine shop and found Williams surrounded by drawings and crude prototypes, bent over a workbench, completely absorbed in his work. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. Williams broke into a rare grin. "Don't worry," he said. "This has nothing to do with an escape. I wouldn't try to escape now if the gate was wide open. I've got too much work to do, and this is a good place to do it." Peoples not only allowed Williams to continue, he actively encouraged him. He gave Williams access to the prison junkyard, where discarded farm machinery and automotive parts rusted in the North Carolina humidity. Williams scavenged old tractor axles, Ford drive shafts, walnut fence posts, and bits of scrap metal that other men saw as garbage. Slowly, methodically, he began building rifles from these discarded pieces. He filed down metal by hand, fitted pieces together with astonishing precision, created working firearms from what should have been impossible materials. Williams built his first rifle from scrap iron and a wooden fence post. It featured an innovation he called a floating chamber, a mechanism that allowed a small, low-power .22 long rifle cartridge to generate enough force to cycle the action of a much larger firearm. This was revolutionary. Until Williams' floating chamber, firearms had to be designed around specific cartridges. The power of the cartridge determined the size and weight of the gun. Williams had found a way to decouple the two, to make a large gun function with small ammunition. The implications for training, for cost savings, for versatility were enormous. His second major innovation was the short-stroke gas piston. In a gas-operated firearm, burning gunpowder creates high-pressure gas. Traditional designs vented this gas through a long tube that pushed a piston, which cycled the action of the gun. Williams realized that you didn't need a long piston stroke. A short, sharp push, a fraction of an inch, could accomplish the same thing with less weight, less complexity, and greater reliability. The short-stroke piston would prove to be one of the most important innovations in firearms history, still used in countless weapons more than a century later. Word of Williams' work began to spread beyond the prison walls. In April 1928, the Charlotte News ran a story with the headline, "An invention that may revolutionize the firearms world, involving radical departures in rapid-fire mechanisms as applied to the automatic rifle, has apparently been perfected by Marshall Williams." That a prisoner at a state farm had created something that might transform an entire industry struck readers as almost unbelievable. But it was true. Representatives from Colt Patent Firearms Company wrote to George Ross Poe, the superintendent of prisons for North Carolina, requesting permission to visit Williams. Poe forwarded the letter directly to Williams. A short time later, Colt sent engineers to Caledonia to examine Williams' inventions firsthand. They left impressed. Meanwhile, Williams' family had not given up on him. His mother, his father, his siblings, all began a quiet but persistent campaign for his release. They were joined by unexpected allies, the sheriff to whom Williams had surrendered after the shooting, and most remarkably, the widow of Deputy Alfred Pate, the man Williams had been convicted of killing. She wrote to the governor, asking that Williams be shown mercy, saying that her husband would not have wanted a young man's entire life destroyed. In 1927, Governor Angus McLean reviewed Williams' case and reduced his sentence to 10 to 20 years. On September 29, 1929, after serving just over 8 years, David Marshall Williams walked out of Caledonia Prison Farm a free man. He was 28 years old. He had entered prison as a violent, directionless young man who had killed a deputy sheriff while defending an illegal moonshine operation. He left prison as one of the most innovative firearms designers in America. Williams returned to Cumberland County and set up a small workshop. He continued refining the designs he'd begun in prison, working long hours in near isolation. In 1931, he traveled to Washington, D.C., to demonstrate his inventions to the U.S. War Department. Ordnance officials were stunned by what they saw, particularly by the floating chamber. They immediately contracted with Williams to modify .30 caliber Browning water-cooled machine guns to fire .22 caliber ammunition using his floating chamber principle. This would allow soldiers to train with inexpensive .22 ammunition instead of costly full-power rounds. The savings to the military were substantial. Williams' reputation grew. Colt Firearms hired him to redesign their .22 training pistol, the Colt Ace. Williams created the service model Ace using his floating chamber, transforming a mediocre training weapon into an excellent one. He also designed a conversion kit that could transform a .45 ACP pistol into a .22 rimfire trainer, or convert a standard Colt Ace into the floating chamber version. It was ingenious, practical, and profitable. After 2 years with Colt, Williams moved to the U.S. Ordnance Department, where he spent 4 years working on various projects. Then came Remington, which used his floating chamber in the Remington Model 550, a .22 semi-automatic rifle that hit the market in 1941. By this time, Williams' innovations were no longer theoretical curiosities. They were being manufactured by major firearms companies and used by thousands of shooters and soldiers. Williams was earning royalties from his patents. He was becoming wealthy. Then, in 1939, Winchester Repeating Arms Company came calling. Winchester was one of the most prestigious firearms manufacturers in America, maker of the legendary lever-action rifles that had won the West. They wanted Williams to work on a military rifle project. Williams accepted. On July 1, 1939, he began work at Winchester's plant in New Haven, Connecticut, on a 1-year contract. Edwin Pugsley, Winchester's chief executive, had been told about Williams by General Julian Hatcher of the U.S. Ordnance Department. Hatcher had said that, in his opinion, Williams showed the greatest native ability of anyone he had ever encountered in the firearms field. Pugsley was impressed by Williams' work, particularly his modifications to the heavy Browning machine gun using the floating chamber principle. But Pugsley also had concerns. Williams was, in Pugsley's words, a peculiar individual. He wondered whether Williams could function within a corporate structure, whether his prickly personality and independent streak would cause problems. Pugsley's concerns would prove prophetic. Williams' first assignment at Winchester was to work on a .30 caliber semi-automatic rifle designed by Ed Browning, brother of the legendary John Moses Browning. Ed Browning had died before completing the rifle, and Winchester engineers couldn't get it to function reliably. Williams diagnosed the problem. The rifle used an unusual piston design that didn't deliver consistent force. Williams proposed replacing it with his short-stroke gas piston. Pugsley agreed. Williams' modification worked. The rifle, designated the M2, still had other problems and would never be adopted by the military, but Williams' short-stroke piston had proven its worth. Then came the summer of 1940, when everything changed. The war in Europe was escalating. France had fallen. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. American military planners, watching the conflict with growing alarm, realized that the United States was woefully unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. The Army needed new weapons, and it needed them quickly. The U.S. Ordnance Department announced a competition for what they called a light rifle, a weapon that would weigh no more than 5 pounds and could serve as a replacement for the heavy M1911A1 pistol and the costly Thompson submachine gun. The weapon needed to have an effective range of 300 yards, be reliable, and be simple enough to manufacture in enormous quantities. It was a tall order. Multiple firearms companies and independent designers submitted prototypes. Winchester, at first, wasn't interested in participating. The company was already busy manufacturing M1 Garand rifles under government contract. But Colonel René Studler of the Ordnance Department had been impressed by Winchester's modified M2 rifle with Williams' short-stroke piston. Studler personally lobbied Winchester to enter the competition. He told Pugsley that the prototypes tested so far were unsatisfactory, that the Army desperately needed this weapon, and that Winchester's M2 design could be scaled down to meet the requirements. Pugsley relented, but there was a problem. The deadline for submissions was in 13 days. 13 days to design, fabricate, and test a completely new firearm. It seemed impossible. Winchester engineers William C. Romer and Fred Humston, along with 3 other engineers, were put on the project under Pugsley's supervision. They worked around the clock, literally sleeping in the factory. Their design was essentially a scaled-down version of the M2 rifle, incorporating Williams' short-stroke gas piston. They cobbled together a prototype using the trigger housing from an old Winchester M1905 rifle, a modified M1 Garand operating rod, and newly machined parts. The prototype was crude, held together with hope and expert improvisation, but it worked. Winchester submitted it just hours before the deadline. Army observers tested the Winchester prototype in August 1941. To everyone's relief and mild surprise, it worked beautifully. The little rifle was light, reliable, and accurate. Felt good in the hand. Soldiers who tested it liked it immediately. The Ordnance Department told Winchester to build a refined version for more extensive trials in September. This is where the story gets complicated, and where David Marshall Williams' difficult personality became a serious problem. Williams believed that he should be in charge of developing the refined prototype. Winchester management, having already experienced Williams' temperamental nature and his inability to work smoothly with others, assigned the project to a team of engineers. Williams was invited to participate but not to lead. Williams was furious. According to Pugsley's later accounts, Williams refused to cooperate with the Winchester team. He sulked. He warned that he would take no responsibility for the weapon, and he insisted that Winchester was trying to steal his ideas without giving him proper credit or compensation. He even allegedly threatened to shoot Fred Humston, one of the lead engineers on the project. Pugsley had to personally intervene to calm the situation. Winchester's engineering team, led by Romer and Humston, proceeded without Williams. They worked frantically to meet the September deadline, refining the crude August prototype into a polished, production-ready design. Williams, meanwhile, worked independently on his own carbine design. He completed it in December 1941, 2 months too late. The Winchester carbine competed successfully against all other entries in September 1941. On October 22, 1941, the U.S. Army officially adopted it as the U.S. Carbine, caliber .30 M1. Winchester had won. The M1 Carbine was born. Now came the question of production. Winchester's factory alone could not produce the millions of carbines the military would need. The Ordnance Department awarded contracts to 10 different manufacturers, most of which had never made firearms before. This was a deliberate strategy. American industry, with its mass production techniques and interchangeable parts, could be mobilized to produce weapons on a scale the world had never seen. The largest producer, by far, was Inland Manufacturing Division, a subsidiary of General Motors that normally made automotive steering components. Inland would produce more than 2.6 million M1 carbines, over 43% of total production. IBM, better known for typewriters and calculating machines, produced about 346,500 carbines. Rockola Manufacturing Corporation, which made jukeboxes, produced around 228,500. Underwood Elliott Fisher, which made typewriters, produced more than 545,000. Winchester itself produced about 810,000. In total, these 10 manufacturers produced more than 6.1 million M1 carbines between 1941 and 1945. To put that number in perspective, the M1 carbine was the most produced American small arm of World War II. More carbines were made than M1 Garand rifles. About 5.4 million Garands were produced. More than Thompson submachine guns, only about 1.3 million Thompsons were manufactured. The little carbine that Winchester had designed in 13 days became the most common weapon in American hands. The M1 carbine was also remarkably cost-effective. At the beginning of the war, the average production cost for an M1 carbine was about $45. An M1 Garand cost approximately $85, nearly double. A Thompson submachine gun cost about $225, 5 times as much. The .30 carbine ammunition was also far cheaper and easier to produce than standard .30-06 ammunition. For a military that would need to arm millions of soldiers and ship weapons and ammunition across 2 oceans to theaters of war on opposite sides of the globe, these cost savings were critical. The M1 carbine was designed for soldiers who needed more firepower than a pistol, but didn't require the range or power of a full battle rifle. Truck drivers, radio operators, mortar crews, artillery crews, tank crews, engineers, medics, and officers all received carbines. Paratroopers got a special variant, the M1A1, with a folding metal stock that could be carried during parachute jumps. More than 140,000 M1A1 carbines were produced, exclusively by inland manufacturing. The carbine fired a .30 caliber cartridge that was closer to a pistol round than a rifle round, but it was far more powerful than any pistol. The 110-grain bullet left the barrel at about 1,900 feet per second, giving it an effective range of around 300 yards. The carbine used a detachable 15-round magazine that could be changed quickly. It weighed about 5.2 pounds. Light enough to carry all day without fatigue. It was 35.6 inches long, short enough to maneuver in tight spaces in vehicles in jungle vegetation. American soldiers carried M1 carbines through the hedgerows of Normandy, across the deserts of North Africa, through the mountains of Italy, and island by island across the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of Allied forces in the Pacific Theater, called the M1 carbine one of the strongest contributing factors to our victory in the Pacific. This was no small praise. MacArthur was notoriously difficult to please, a military genius and an egomaniac in equal measure. For him to single out one weapon as a key factor in victory meant something. In the Pacific, the M1 carbine proved particularly valuable. The jungle fighting of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Philippines, and Okinawa required weapons that could be carried through dense vegetation, operated in extreme humidity and heat, and deliver rapid firepower at close range. The M1 Garand, though an excellent rifle, was heavy and long. The Thompson submachine gun, though deadly at close range, was even heavier and burned through ammunition at an alarming rate. The M1 carbine was a perfect middle ground, light, compact, reliable, and with enough magazine capacity to sustain fire in the sudden, brutal close-range firefights that characterized jungle warfare. Soldiers loved the M1 carbine for its lightweight and ease of use. Some complained about its stopping power. The .30 carbine round didn't hit as hard as a .30-06 from an M1 Garand, and in the heat of combat, enemy soldiers sometimes kept coming even after being hit by carbine fire. But for the vast majority of soldiers who carried it, the carbine was exactly what they needed. A weapon they could carry all day without exhaustion, that could be brought to bear quickly, and that gave them a fighting chance if they suddenly came under attack. By the time the war ended in August 1945, M1 carbines had been carried into battle on every continent except Antarctica. They had been used by Army infantry, Marine Corps raiders, Navy shore parties, Army Air Corps flight crews, and countless support personnel. They had been dropped into occupied France with the resistance, used by Chinese nationalist forces fighting the Japanese, and issued to free French forces. The little carbine had proven itself in every climate and every condition. After the war, the M1 Carbine continued to serve. It saw action in Korea, where soldiers fighting in brutal cold discovered that the carbine's reliability suffered in extreme winter conditions. It was used in Vietnam by American advisors in the early 1960s and by South Vietnamese forces. It was used by police departments across America. It became one of the most widespread military surplus weapons in civilian hands, beloved by hunters and target shooters for its lightweight and mild recoil. And what of David Marshall Williams, the prickly, difficult, brilliant man whose short-stroke gas piston had made the M1 Carbine possible? His story took on a life of its own, one that often diverged from historical fact. In 1952, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer released a film called Carbine Williams, starring Jimmy Stewart. The movie portrayed Williams as the sole inventor of the M1 Carbine, a lone genius working against the system, whose prison-built prototypes directly led to the weapon that helped win the war. The truth was more complicated. Williams did not invent the M1 Carbine. The carbine was designed by a team of Winchester engineers working under tremendous time pressure. Williams' contribution was the short-stroke gas piston, a critical component to be sure, but only one part of a larger whole. Moreover, even the short-stroke piston wasn't entirely Williams' original idea. Patent searches would later reveal that prior art existed. Other inventors had designed similar mechanisms before Williams filed his patents. But none of this diminishes Williams' genuine achievements. He invented the floating chamber, which revolutionized firearms training and made numerous weapons possible. He refined and perfected the short-stroke gas piston, even if he wasn't the first to conceive of it. He went from convicted murderer to respected firearms designer through sheer force of talent and will. He held over 50 patents. He worked for every major American firearms manufacturer of his era. His innovations are still used in firearms design today, more than a century after he first sketched them on a drafting board in a prison machine shop. Williams continued working for Winchester into the early 1950s, though the relationship remained stormy. He eventually left the company amid mutual recriminations. Williams accused Winchester of stealing his ideas and not giving him proper credit. Winchester executives, privately, expressed relief that the difficult, temperamental designer was finally gone. One memo written by Edwin Pugsley in 1951 stated bluntly that Williams was probably the most unpopular man in the section, and that he went out of his way to insult and estrange practically every man he was supposed to work with. After his final break with Winchester, Williams became a celebrity of sorts. The film Carbine Williams made him famous. He toured the country making appearances, signing autographs, and telling his story. He always signed his name, Carbine Williams, embracing the nickname that linked him forever to the weapon that bore his innovation. He wore a Stetson hat, grew long sideburns, and often had a cigar clenched between his teeth. He looked like a character from a Western film, which perhaps suited him. In his later years, Williams suffered from various health problems. Years of hard living, the moonshining days, the prison years, the stress of his tempestuous career, had taken their toll. He donated his personal collection of firearms and his workshop to the North Carolina Museum of History, where they remain on display. An exhibit dedicated to Williams' life and work opened on June 22, 1971, 4 years before his death. On January 8, 1975, David Marshall Williams died at Dorothea Dix Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was 74 years old. He was buried at Old Bluff Presbyterian Church outside of Wade, North Carolina, not far from where he had been born and where, more than 50 years earlier, he had made moonshine in the woods. Williams' life defies simple categorization. He was a murderer who helped arm the forces of freedom. He was a difficult, often unpleasant man who created things of lasting value. He was a convict who became an inventor, a dropout who revolutionized an industry, a moonshiner who ended up working for the United States government. His story is uniquely American, flawed, violent, redemptive, brilliant. The M1 Carbine stands as his most visible legacy, though he neither invented it nor deserves sole credit for it. More than 6 million were made during World War II. Millions more were produced after the war. The weapon served in conflicts from 1942 through the 1960s and beyond. It was carried by American soldiers in the greatest military victory in the nation's history. General MacArthur was right to praise it. It was, indeed, one of the strongest contributing factors to Allied victory. But the M1 Carbine's deeper legacy is what it represented. American industrial might mobilized for war. 10 different manufacturers, most with no firearms experience, produced millions of identical, interchangeable weapons in just 4 years. This was only possible because of American mass production techniques, standardized parts, and a manufacturing infrastructure unmatched anywhere in the world. The Germans, the Japanese, even the British and Soviets could not match American industrial production. The M1 Carbine was a small symbol of this vast advantage. Every carbine that rolled off the production line at an IBM or Rockola or Inland factory was another unit of American industrial power translated into military force. David Marshall Williams' short-stroke gas piston made the carbine lighter, simpler, and more reliable than it would have been otherwise. That was his contribution, and it was significant. But the real miracle of the M1 Carbine was not in any single innovation. It was in the marriage of design and mass production, in the ability of American industry to take a weapon designed in 13 frantic days and produce it in quantities that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier. When Williams died in 1975, the world he had known, the world of moonshine stills and state prison farms, of blacksmith shops and hand-filed metal, of Winchester and Colt and Browning, was already fading into history. Firearms design had moved on. Computer-aided design, polymer frames, and new materials were changing the industry. But Williams' innovations remained. The short-stroke gas piston and the floating chamber, conceived in a prison machine shop by a convicted murderer with an 8th-grade education, are still fundamental to modern firearms design. That is Williams' ultimate legacy. Not the Hollywood myth, not the simplified tale of the convict who invented the M1 Carbine, but the verified historical truth that a man with nothing but his hands and his mind created mechanical innovations that outlived him and changed his industry forever. He was difficult, he was flawed, he was capable of violence. He was also capable of genius. In the end, both truths are part of his story, and neither can be separated from the other. The M1 Carbine, America's most produced weapon of World War II, carries within it the ghost of David Marshall Williams. Brilliant, troubled, impossible, and unforgettable. Every one of those 6.1 million carbines manufactured during the war operated on a principle that Williams refined, if not invented, in a North Carolina prison while serving time for murder. History is rarely simple. Heroes are rarely pure. And sometimes, the weapons that help save democracy are designed by men who once took a life in defense of illegal moonshine. This is the strange, true story of how one prisoner's crazy invention became the most common weapon in American hands during the greatest war the world has ever known.